Hello everyone! Today I'm going to be doing a part 2 of the wire weaving patterns which I posted before. That one included 9 different quite basic wire weaving patterns with either 2, 3 or 4 base wires. And today we're going to do another 6, again using either 2, 3 or 4 base wires. And we're going to start out with the first one, which is a 2 base wire weaving pattern. And I've actually colored this in 2 different colors, so you see the blue and the red. Because what's important for this weave is that you're going to do things in front of the base wires and also in the back. So the blue is when the weaving wire is in front of the base wires, and the red is where the weaving wire would be behind the base wires. And this weave is also known as the figure 8 weave. It's quite a popular one. It's used in a lot of hidi pieces. It's used in a lot of different more intricate high-end pieces. And it's quite fun to do, but it's a more intermediate weave as opposed to the other ones which are more beginner friendly. So I'd like to show you some pieces which actually incorporate this weave. And these are pieces that I've made recently which incorporate this weave. For example, you can see here at the bottom I've used this figure 8 weave. There's one wire above it in this case, but that's not always necessary. And I've also used it right here at the top. And as you can see, it frames the piece quite nicely, and you can create dimension by opening up the wires more or less. And that's actually a very large example. Here we have a smaller piece, which also includes this weave here at the side. And this one is even more curved than the previous one, which I'll explain in a bit. That needs to be done in a slightly different way than just your average figure 8 weave. So today I'm going to be working with 18 gauge round dead soft copper wire, and I'm going to be using coated wire. So this is tarnish resistant, which is also why it's quite orange. And as weaving wire, I'm going to be using some, 26 gauge. So nice thin wire. You could also use 20 and 28 if you'd prefer. I just do all my pieces in 18 and 26. So how I always start out my weaves, it doesn't really matter what pattern I use, just to secure them. I always put my thumb on top of the weaving wire, which is on top of the base wire, and I just curve or curl around the base wire 3 times to create 3 little loops, using my nail to push the weave against, or the loops against each other. So that creates 3 little loops. So that's the start of each of these weaves. I'm not gonna say that every time, but I always start out with the 3 little loops. Now then you're gonna want to attach the second base wire. Normally I would lay it on top, so the base or the weaving wire would be at the back. But in this case I'm not gonna put it on top, but I'm gonna put it below it. And then you're gonna want to take 1 loop around it, going in between the 2 base wires. Just gonna tighten it. And then when you are doing the second loop, rather than just doing a full loop around the base wire, you're gonna curl it until you're below the 2 base wires, and you're gonna come up in between the 2. You're gonna pull a little bit, not too tightly, just a little bit of tension to make it neat, and you're gonna do 1 loop around the bottom base wire. And then instead of again doing a full loop around the base wire, you're gonna pull it until you're below both base wires, and then you're gonna come up in between, pulling it a little bit towards the side. You're gonna do 1 full loop around the top base wire. Now As you can see, there isn't really much space between these two base wires yet. So you could keep this very tight if you want to, but you're not going to get that interesting figure 8 pattern that you could see on the pieces that I just showed you. So what you're gonna want to do is actually spread these wires gently apart. You don't want to just kink them apart. You want to just gently use your finger to curl the wires apart. And you can make that as open or as closed as you prefer. As you can see, this one actually spreads apart quite widely towards the end. And you're gonna just repeat this process. So you do one full loop around the base wire, and then with the second loop, rather than doing a full loop around the base wire, you're gonna come up in between the two base wires and wrap around the base wire that's opposite. So again, I was now at the point where I needed to come up between. I'm gonna do one full wrap around the bottom, and then I'm gonna do again a loop until I'm at the bottom of both of the base wires. I'm gonna come up in between, pull it a little bit towards the side so it's nice and neat against the previous section. We do one full loop around the top, pull again, and we continue by coming up between the two, pulling again, doing a full loop, and then the second one, rather than doing a full loop, you're going to come up in between the two, make a full loop around that base wire, pull a little bit, and then once again you continue as you have before. Now, as you continue this, because you've spread the wires apart, that interesting figure 8 pattern is gonna start showing. You could also make this a little bit wider, so doing just one loop around the base wire and then using the second loop to go in between and opposite to the next base wire is one way to do it. You could also do 2 full loops around the base wire and then use the third loop to go in between the base wires and to the opposite one. You could also do 3 or 4, as many as you'd like. And just take into account, I'm going to put this away now, take into account that the more loops you do in between this weave, the opener it's going to get. So for example, we have this piece here where I did that weave and I used, I think, 5 or 6 between this end and then 2 or 3 on this side. And that leaves you with quite an open figure 8 weave. So the example that I just showed you, this one, is where the 2 base wires are of equal distance to one another, right? So this, we would just continue this weave all the way until you're to the point where you want to stop it. You would cut off your weaving wire. Let me just get my pliers to do that. And you would just attach it or use it in your piece. Now, there is a different way you can do this, where you use it as a more curved one. So let's say you would do this one toward this side, and then you would also curve this one towards the side. And maybe you even want to close it up in the end, like sort of like this. Just curve it a little bit. Let's say this is the shape you want to make, so you want to make it curved. And you're going to see that this side, which is more curved than the inner one, is going to need more weaving wire to be completely full of loops, as opposed to this wire, which is going to need less. So that means that while you're weaving, you need to make sure that you put more loops on this side, in between the loops that you use to go to the opposite wire, than on this side. So that's what I showed in the piece, in this piece. So here there are about 3 loops in between each loop that you use to cross over. And then in between these there can be 5 or 6 depending on where you are on the curve. So when you just start the curve, you might increase from 3 to 4, and then when you go on, you may want to go to 5, maybe even to 6. But then when you get back closer, the base wires get closer to one another again, you're going to want to decrease. So you're going to use 4 and then 3, and then maybe even back to 1 again if that's what you want. So that's how you do the figure 8 weave, which is again quite an intermediate weave, because it's difficult to keep the tension, it's difficult to keep it neat and straight, and especially if you're going to curve it or anything, you're going to most likely create some gaps. And that's something that the gaps, you're not ever going to fully get rid of them. So even though, as you can see in this piece, I've wrapped this quite tightly. Also, because this one is also curved, I also did more loops on one side than the other, because that makes the gaps as little as possible. But you can still see that there's some gaps here and there in this piece. So that's the first one. That took a little bit of time to explain, but that's because it's not the easiest weave to do. Then the second one we're going to do today is actually a somewhat easier weaving pattern, which I use quite frequently. For ring bands, for example. So I've used it in this this ring. This is my poppy design, which I think was inspired by either Oksana Crafts or Lan Handmade. I don't remember which one. But then in the band, you can see I've used this interesting weave where it's a couple of loops around one base wire, a couple of loops around both, and then a couple of loops around, single loops around the other base wires, and continuing on. So that's the weave I'm going to show you now. So again, you need 2 base wires. I'm gonna just attach my weaving wire quickly. So that's 3 little loops. And this time you're gonna attach your second base wire by just laying it over top of the weaving wire and doing a loop that goes around both base wires. And then you'll do another loop that goes around both base wires. Don't pull too tightly. You still want to have space between these 2 base wires, because if there's no space between the 2 base wires, you're not going to be able to pull this weave off. So the next step is actually creating loops around the top base wire, which is just, again, bringing the weaving wire down in between the 2 wires. I use my nail to push in the wire, and then I tend to prefer 3, so I do 3 little loops using my nail again to just squash that in there. And then once I've done 3 little loops, as you can see here, you will go around both base wires again and just do 2 loops. And then you're going to come up in between the 2 base wires with your weaving wire, and you're going to do 3 more single loops around the bottom base wire. And then you're going to continue this, so 2 loops around both, and then you're going to go to the top where you're going to do 3 loops around the top. Let me just quickly finish that and then show you what it looks like once you compress that with your pliers. Because as you can see, we've done some repeats now, and it's looking quite loose, right? And maybe that's something you prefer. You can leave it like that, but I don't prefer that. So I'm going to take my flat nose pliers. I'm going to put my nail on one side of the weave. I'm going to take my pliers and just gently push it in. And once I've pushed it in, I'm going to flatten it by just gently squeezing it with my pliers. And that creates a way tighter finish. So it looks quite different, and you need to compress the weave and flatten the weave as you go to make sure that it continues to look this neat. So that was this one. Again, I'm not going to finish it off neatly because they're just practice pieces, but that's how this weave would look. Then on to the 3 base wire weaving patterns. bringing in the notebook again. Many of you actually mentioned that you quite preferred the way that I've drawn these out, so I'm going to continue doing that. So the third weave that we're going to do is kind of a variation on the second one, except you're going to use 3 base wires and not just 2. So if I take that ring again, which I showed you earlier, you're going to do the single loops, but they're not going to be single loops now. They're going to be double, right? So they're going to use 2 base wires. And then you've got the loops that go around all base wires. And then on the opposite side, you once again have the loops that in the previous pattern would be single loops, but in this pattern, it's around 2 base wires. So let me put this aside and get 3 base wires for you. I'm going to attach my weaving wire again, like I always do. And then I'm going to attach the second base wire again, putting it over top of the weaving wire and just doing a loop around both and doing another loop around both. Then I'm going to attach my third base wire by again putting it over top of the weaving wire, and I'm going to wrap around all 3 base wires, keeping nice tension but not too tight, otherwise you're not going to be able to continue to weave. So now we do a wrap the opposite side, right? We're going to take the top 2 base wires and do 2 loops around that. So there we go, using my nail again to push in the weave. And then we can continue, so 2 more loops around all 3 base wires. And once we finish that, you're going to do 2 loops around the bottom 2. You just continue this pattern, so 2 again around all 3. There we go, and then 2 around the top 2. As you can see, just like with the previous one, this is not looking that neat. It's not looking sophisticated, so I'm gonna again take my flat nose pliers, put my nail against the weave on one side, and just gently push in this weave. And as you can see, this one you can press even tighter, which means it almost looks like you fully used wire around it, but you haven't. And you have to be careful, because sometimes if you're not using the right tension, these loops around all 3 base wires want to just cross over one another. You don't want that. You want them to lay nice and flat next to one another. Pay some extra attention to make sure that that doesn't happen. And again, you continue this weave until you're satisfied with the length that you've reached. So let me just once again cut this off. And we can move on to the next one, which is, I don't really have this exact weave in a piece, which is the 4th one, but I do have a variation on it in one of the pieces that I've done, which is this ring here, where you can see the pattern is kind of, you take loops around all 3 base wires. So this one of course includes way more than 3 base wires, which is why I said it's a variation on the pattern. But you would do loops around all base wires, doesn't really matter how many. And then you would do this simple weaving pattern where you do 3 loops around 1 base wire, 2 loops around the other 2 base wires, and then 3 single ones again, 2 double ones, 3 single ones, and so on, for as long as you want, really. And then you continue by again using loops around all base wires. And then you go to the opposite direction and you repeat the pattern which you chose to do in between these sections. So I'm going to show you this one, which might take a little bit longer, because for you to actually see this pattern, you're going to need to do a couple of repeats, right? So I'm going to just do the sections in between the full wraps little bit shorter than I might do if I used it on an actual piece, because I would like to do at least 2 or 3 repeats to actually maximize the effect. So for now, I'm just gonna, need to open this up a little bit for me to be able to see. So I'm gonna do that basic weave again, which I actually showed you in a previous video. So 3 loops around the bottom base wire and then 2 loops around the top. So I'm gonna just run through that a little bit quickly. So if you want more detailed information on this specific weave, just check out my previous video. It should be in the same playlist as this one. So let's say you want to do 3 repeats, which is what I've done, or I'm almost done doing right now. Okay, so we have 3 little repeats of this weave, and then you're going to attach the 3rd base wire, which you're going to again lay over top of the weaving wire, right? And then you're going to loop around all 3. Wrap around, loop around all 3 twice. You can do it 3 times, you can do it 4, however many times you want, but I prefer 2. You're going to just repeat the pattern, but at the opposite side. So in this case, I'm going to do 3 repeats of that simple weave at the top of the piece. And let me just quickly run through that so it doesn't take up too much time. So here we go. I've now sort of done one section, and this would be one full repeat of this weave. So I would continue this on for however long I would like. And I'm going to compress this again to show you what that looks like. So you can compress it as little or as much as you'd like. So you can compress it all the way where you can see that these full loops around all 3 base wires, they're gonna just come in, right? So they're gonna sort of form a triangular shape. But you can also, if you don't prefer that, you can just gently squeeze them in, and you can keep them straight if that's what you prefer. It's all up to you. And there we go. That would be this weave. And again, just cutting it off. Normally, of course, you would neatly tuck in the edge to make sure nothing is catching on it. But I'm not going to do that because it's practice pieces. All right, moving on. The next one is using 4 base wires. So the first one is actually quite popular. And also you see this weave in a couple of pieces. And it can be done in a couple of ways. So it's a weave that takes a bit of time if you do it in the way that I've displayed it here. So if you only use 3 single loops in between these pyramidical sections, it's gonna take a lot of time and a lot of wire and a lot of patience. And I don't always have that much patience. So you could also use it. So this is the weave, how it looks. It's quite an interesting one, right? And in this case, I haven't used the 3 loops, I've used 4. But you could also use 5, you could use 10. And depending on how many loops you put in between these sort of pyramidical sections, it's gonna spread wider apart. And if you are a diehard and you have an infinite amount of patience, you're gonna do just 3 loops in between, and you're gonna get this very nice and tight pattern, which I used on this Aventurine piece. But that will take you some patience. Just be warned. So I'm gonna take 4 base wires and show you how this works. I'm gonna again just attach my weaving wire like I always do. There we go. Simple 3 loops, nothing complicated. And then we're going to attach our second base wire, again putting it over top of the weaving wire. And we're going to do one loop around both of these. Let me just put that out of the way. One loop around both of these base wires. And then right away we're going to attach our third base wire. And how we're going to attach that by looping around the two top base wires. So the one you just attached and the one you're going to attach now. So that's one loop going in between the bottom two base wires, using your nail to push that in and wrapping around, right? And then we're going to attach the fourth base wire, go over the top two and go in between. So that's just repeating the pattern that we're doing, right? So it's always around two base wires. And then you're going to wrap once around the whole thing. And making sure you always end up with the weaving wire back at the top. You're going to continue this weave by wrapping this weaving wire around the top two base wires. So going in between the second and third from the bottom. All right, so we have this loop at this side. Then you're going to come up between the top two wires that you have just wrapped around, bringing the weaving wire back towards the front. And then you're going to pull a little bit just to tighten it in. You're going to wrap around the next two. So that will be, in this case, the middle two. So going down between the first and the second base wire. And then to finish the loop, you're going to come up in between the second and the third base wire, again counting from the bottom. Gonna again pull that a little bit towards the side to tighten it, and then wrap around the next two base wires. So that will be the bottom two. And to finish the wrap, you're gonna come up between the first and the second. So it's always a loop around two base wires, and it's always gonna end up with you coming up in between those base wires. And then you've already finished one repeat of this weave. So you're gonna do, I'll let you do 3 little single loops around the bottom. So that will be one repeat. Now this is a weave that again you need to compress, because that will tighten it up nicely. Putting your nail on one side, taking your pliers and just pressing it in. And then the easiest way to flatten this weave, because that does look better in my opinion, is to flatten it from the side where this section is pointing. So you're not going to use the bottom base wire, that side, to flatten it, because that might cause some of the wires to cross over. You don't want that. So you're just going to press it down, compress it using your flat nose pliers around from that side. Right, so that's one repeat. And we can continue this again, just looping the first two, looping around the second two, and looping around the last two. Then doing one full wrap around all four, ending up at the top again, doing a loop around the top two, coming up in between the top two, doing a loop around the second two or the middle two, coming up in between those, doing a loop around the bottom two, and coming up in between those. And then you have done another repeat, doing 3 little single loops between that. Again, nicely compressing it, flattening it, and then you have done a second repeat of this weave. So you can imagine that this takes quite a bit of time if you need to do a long length, just because of the amount of wraps you need to do. And then we're already at the last one, which is good because I didn't want this one to be over 40 minutes again. So the last one is the 6th one, and that's actually a variation on the pyramidical weave that you've seen in my previous video for like, I think I used 3 base wires then. And this is just half the pyramid. So you're going up, but you're not going down. You're just going up and whoop, right away back to the first base wire. So I'm going to show you how that works. Again, using 4 base wires. We're going to just attach my weaving wire, and we're going to attach the second base wire, again laying it over top. There we go. And doing 2 wraps around both. Again, not pulling too tightly, because you do need to have this space between these two eventually. Now we're going to attach the third base wire, which again is just looping all the way around all 3 of them. So you're going to just loop around all 3 until you end up at the top again. And then you're going to attach the 4th base wire by once again wrapping around all 4 of the base wires with your weaving wire. So that would be half a pyramid, right? But rather than continuing by doing another 2 wraps around the bottom 3, another 2 wraps around the bottom 2, and then another couple of wraps around the bottom base wire, we're going to skip that and we're going to go straight to the bottom and do a couple of loops around the bottom base wire. So again, I like doing things in 3. So that's 3 little loops around the bottom base wire. And you continue this weave by once again doing, let me just spread this apart a little bit, 2 loops around the bottom 2 base wires, 2 loops around the bottom 3 base wires, and then 2 loops around all 4 of them. There we go. And then you do 3 or more loops around the bottom base wire again. And then you have 2 repeats of this weave. Again, a weave that you need to compress. So I'm just gonna this time put my nail at the other end, doesn't really matter. And just use my pliers at an angle, because you want to kind of use the angle of the pyramid and put your pliers against that to just tighten it. And then you flatten it. There you go. And then you have 2 nice and neat repeats of this weave. Again, finishing off, tucking in the edges, making sure it's nice and neat and you don't get anything caught on there. And that would be all 6 weaving patterns that I was going to show you today. So I hope that these have been helpful and that you'll be able to try some of these weaving patterns out yourself. So thank you for watching. If you're interested in supporting me in any way, shape or form, you may want to follow me on Instagram, which is in the description box. Or you might want to check out my Etsy, which is where I sell some tutorials as well as my jewelry and some other fun stuff. And I will also leave that link in the description. A like, a comment or a subscribe would be much appreciated, but not necessary for you to enjoy these videos. So I hope you have a very nice day, and I'll see you all next time.